Okay, whatever. All right. Cheese vaults. This is a presentation in which I attempt to cheese pill my loved ones, possibly to their detriment. We're just gonna get started. All right.
Fuck yeah.
It's a little overview. All right, a couple things. You cannot trust the dairy. You already know that. That's a fact that everybody knows. Two, you cannot trust the government. I deeply hope that you knew that in your heart and brain. If you didn't know that, this is a big day for you. But most people are very aware of this fact. Three, cheese vaults are merely a lens through which to interpret your reality. They're not like learning about cheese vaults. The concept in itself is not like the end goal. It's a lens through which you will interpret everything for the rest of your life. For there will probably be tangents in this presentation. I actually know there will. I've already made the presentation. The tangents are marked with the word tangent. All right. So let's get going on the history of cheese vaults. Slide number 3, origins of cheese vaults. All right. So I was with World War I. There was a massive increase in demand for dairy for a number of reasons, such as like easy transportation and storage of products like powdered milk. The why here, as far as like dairy, like dairy production increasing, isn't as important as just the fact that it happened in the first place and the fact that it was a catalyst for a major shift in the American farming industry towards dairy and away from a lot of other potentially more sustainable foods. The dairy industry grew like really large at this time, and it became this very powerful economic force. So when the Depression rolled around, the Great Depression, the government was obviously going to prioritize them for relief. So this is when the government began subsidizing the dairy industry. And from there, it just never really stopped. What do I have on the slide here? It says, oh my God, cheese surplus, Ronald Reagan. It got to the point where the dairy industry was producing product in excess massively. And the government, which was totally dependent on the dairy industry politically and economically, started buying their surplus milk and storing it as cheese in these massive underground vaults. So this started around the Great Depression. So yeah, in essence, government subsidies to the dairy industry, cheese surplus from the dairy industry, cheese vaults, cheese surplus, Ronald Reagan, cheese surplus, cheese surplus, cheese surplus, cheese surplus. This is a meme. What the meme says: 1, customers want stuff. 2, businesses meet demand. This is what you think happens. Now, what actually happens? 1, business discovers it can increase oatmeal production 1,000 times. 2, what the hell are we going to do with all these oats? 3, global psyop to get people to eat cereal for breakfast. Now this is what I want to like get into essentially. We don't get straight to the global psyop part of things, but we do eventually get there. This is the overall arc I want to describe and sort of how it applies to everything in your life. And we will get into sort of the why of how the power and influence of the dairy industry works in a moment. But yeah, let's go. Okay, so the government begins buying surplus milk in the 1940s and 50s. Again, I didn't already say this, so this isn't again. They are buying just for the sake of keeping prices from falling. They are buying to stabilize prices, keep them from falling despite the excessive production. They don't need the cheese. The government does not want or need this cheese. They buy the milk, they store it as cheese because it's a convenience, okay? Stabilizes prices, big underground caves. This is just the way reality works. So we start seeing the ways they try to handle this excess. The National School Lunch Program, instituted in 1946, is a prime example of this. It's the government trying to get more dairy into your diet, a little bit less in the cheese vaults, a little bit more in your sweet little tummy. This hasn't fundamentally changed in the last 75 years. You still get milk with every school lunch. There's just kind of a quota on it. We're all in high school, right? I don't know what's going on. We're all in high school, and every day we go to high school together because we're 4 sweet little like 17-year-old friends, and we all get our little cup of milk. And sometimes I get 2 if I feel like splurging. Chocolate. Anyways, the government trying to get more dairy into your diet, and this has not fundamentally changed in the last 75 years. Another thing they did to try to take care of all this dairy excess was to export it as food aid to other countries, but it still wasn't making a massive dent in the overall amount of excess dairy that was being produced. A lot of it still sat unused in these underground vaults. Now, there was a period in the 70s where the economy tanked and there was, in fact, a shortage of dairy, which is like, oh, nice. It is actually nice to have some excess dairy because they pretty much went through it. But, at that time, yeah, there's a shortage. So, of course, prices went up. That's supply and demand, which is actually the myth we're debunking tonight. But, there's supply and demand. The prices went up. The government tried to intervene. They went way, way, way back down. And the dairy industry was like, oh, my God, what the fuck? The end result of this was, of course, just more subsidies for the dairy industry. Nothing actually changed. There was some fluctuation for a while that decade, and then it was just like, yeah, the government is going to give the dairy industry more money. So things pretty much went back to how they were before, and the cheese surpluses started piling up again. So we get into the 80s, and that's when we get to Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan, not wanting to see money go to waste when it could go to a worthy cause, like developing the biggest, most bloated imperialist force in the history of the world, tried to stop this practice of buying the dairy industry surplus. That actually did not go over too well with the dairy industry and the powerful people in it, so it didn't really last. However, what he did do, and what the Reagan administration did accomplish, was it started offloading some of this excess cheese, a portion of it, through welfare programs. And that is government cheese, baby. You guys know the expression government cheese. This phrase. This is from the Reagan era, because they were literally just giving away cheese from these massive vaults. And this is actually like what I think makes Reagan like a good politician, in the sense that, like, because even as he loathed the poor and the vulnerable and cared only about laying down the foundations for policy that would grow the military, make the rich richer, and generally erode any last vestiges of a democratic government that placed even an iota of value on human life, he could recognize the bad optics of letting millions starve while millions of pounds of food sat in caves completely untouched and just growing moldy. So government cheese in this era was like a specific type of cheese. It wasn't very good. It's just what was easy to make and store. If you were someone who was receiving government cheese, you were getting something comparable in taste to a Velveeta, according to all the accounts I've read of this, probably with a little bit more mold on it. But it's just like something that made a decent grilled cheese sandwich. It fed the poor, like, to a certain extent. But in the form that it existed, it couldn't last that long. Not because there wasn't enough of it, but because of just philosophical issues. Oh, here's a slide I added. It says, imagine there being so much of something that even okay, fine, we can give some to the poor, fucking whatever. What we have here is a slide that says, let's meditate on power for a second. Gavin, this goes back to your question from a few minutes ago. It's just about like the relation, and this is sort of like in a general sense, this is stuff that people already have like a core understanding of in America because it's a very bad country, but it's kind of important to just lay it down anyway, just for like the sake of coherence in this presentation. So policy is fueled by politics. Politics are fueled by the exchange of money and power. Politicians allocate funding to industries whose lobbyists support these politicians financially and help to keep them in power. So the essence of it is the dairy industry is full of a very important voter base for a number of reasons, and they just straight up donate a lot of money to politicians' re-election campaigns. That's how you give money to politicians. You donate during re-election cycles. They get wealthier. They stay in power. This is just sort of the essence of American politics. It's cyclical, and it's a key part of how wealth in America is concentrated and hoarded. The dairy industry's power is primarily in its wealth, but it's also in its important as a voter base, and it's in the optics. It's a lot of optics about farming as just sort of America's backbone, and the dairy industry really takes advantage of this idea. Optics are huge in this case, but money is even bigger. But these things are like kind of fairly obvious. There's things like every American, I think, has like a core understanding of. What I really want to talk about is let's meditate on liberalism for a second. So like Liberalism, like the modern definition, the way we talk about it in America, is as like the force opposed to conservatism, right? It's like everybody's liberal or conservative. They're opposing forces. Liberalism, by like its original definition, is not a force that's opposed to conservatism. American conservatism is really just a form of liberalism, which is like in essence really closer to what you think of like now as libertarianism. It's closer to libertarianism than progressivism, and it's in complete opposition to socialism, the concept of liberalism, like as a political philosophy. Liberalism is about like the dominance of private industry, the free market. So it's really kind of what you think about as conservatism. The modern definitions in America specifically have been pretty warped. So this is why Ronald Reagan is a liberal, Obama is a liberal, Joe Biden's a liberal. They all come from the same essential school of thought, which is a major prioritization of private industry over anything publicly funded. They see any public service as a necessary evil, any welfare as a necessary evil, something that should be minimized as much as possible. And this is why like the USPS is not actually funded by tax dollars. It hasn't been for years because it's an active like liberal effort to destroy the USPS as an industry, to dismantle it by not giving it enough funding. Same reason Obamacare is based in employment, and a major selling point of Obamacare is that you get the luxury of shopping for health insurance on the free market rather than actually just having health care. These all come from the same place. So this is why Ronald Reagan, Barack Obama, George Bush, Joe Biden, they're all liberals. They all come from the exact same school of thought. And this is why government cheese as a concept couldn't really survive in its original incarnation, because it was just giving things away. So we kind of come back to this quote from Ronald Reagan where he says like, we can't watch millions of pounds of food turn to waste. What that really means, interpreted through this lens, is cheese that's being given away is a waste because it's not making profit, right? Like you can't privatize that if you're giving it away to the poor who should die. But yeah, so government cheese can't really survive in that form. So it moves forward into like the era of privatization, and that's when you get Dairy Management Inc. This came in 1995. And this is another spot where we can kind of get into the specifics about like what the influence of the dairy industry, what their political power actually looks like in practice. So Dairy Management Inc. is a branch of the USDA. They're a marketing group, essentially. What they do is they collect like checkoff payments, they call them, from dairy producers. So dairy producers pay into this quasi-publicly funded industry, and that is used to fund marketing, which most famously is, of course, Got Milk. I went forward 2 slides instead of 1. We're on Got Milk, all right? So just really like incessant, omnipresent marketing in your life that led you to spend like your childhood through like teen years thinking milk is something that's just good for you, right? It's so healthy. It's in fact essential to your health. But like quasi publicly funded or not, it's 100% just a marketing campaign, and it's the government telling you to consume dairy. So dairy producers will keep funding politicians' re-election campaigns. And you can kind of look up the statistics like you can with any industry of like, hey, which of your congressmen took how much money from this industry? Which of your congressmen took how much money from the dairy industry, and what pro-dairy legislation they produce? Same as guns with the NRA and fucking whatever. It's an identical concept in that sense. So all these practices, you know, they aren't essentially giving cheese away. They're sort of just the new incarnation of government cheese, because they're just a way to reduce the pointless surplus, but now they're still generating profit for the dairy industry. So it's more beneficial for the industry, more beneficial for the politicians if they can sell more of this cheese rather than give more of it away, right? So slightly less well-known efforts from the DMI are things like the 7 cheese pizza at Domino's, Taco Bell's Quesalupo, which is extremely cheese heavy. Food is just packed with ungodly amounts of cheese, and like way beyond what the USDA could try to pass off as good for you. And this quote, which is being slightly blocked out, let me move this. A 2017 Bloomberg Business Week investigation called the group of chemists and nutritionists the Illuminati of Cheese. The checkoff program puts DMI's agents inside Burger King, Domino's, McDonald's, Pizza Hut, and Wendy's, where they're privy to each restaurant chain's most closely guarded secrets. So yeah, this literally the Illuminati of cheese. The amount of power and influence is unreal. Its effect on American public health is massive, and we're going to get more into that later. So yeah, this is just something kind of wild to me. It's a little quote from an article from FEE.org. The United States dairy surplus. This is from 2019. The United States dairy surplus has reached a record high, rounding out at 1.4 billion pounds of cheese. Reports attempting to quantify this astonishing amount have deferred to metrics like enough to wrap around the U.S. Capitol. Suffice to say, nobody is suggesting we could consume it all. Again, this is just last year that we have 1.4 billion pounds of cheese in storage that we have nothing to fucking do with, just from this exchange of money and cheese between the government and the dairy industry. Quick tangent on Canada. So this is a photo from a Canadian maple syrup storage warehouse, because the United States is not the only country that does this shit. This is in the town of Laurierville. The caption here says, deep in the heart of Quebec, it's a former furniture warehouse that has been converted to hold half the world's supply of maple syrup. This strategic reserve is designed to stabilize the price and supply of maple syrup for a growing global market, and all commercial maple producers in Quebec are required to deliver part of their crop to the reserve each year. Yeah, so it's the same concept, just in another country. Capitalism is the same wherever you go. I just have this here because I think it's interesting, the strategic maple syrup reserve. It works a little differently, but it's the same core concept, because the maple syrup producers have to donate to it, and then they get paid for it when the maple syrup actually sells. In 2010 and 2011, there was what was called the Great Canadian Maple Syrup Heist, in which a small group siphoned off about 3,000 tons of maple syrup as it was being transported from one storage facility to another. This is what's still considered, adjusting for inflation, to be the most valuable heist in Canadian history. 3,000 tons of maple syrup, massively valuable, and they would just kind of like sell it off to distributors who didn't actually know where it came from. That's just like something fun to include here. The really important thing to take away is capitalism is the same wherever. Canada, maple syrup, America, cheese, fucking same things. All right. So we'll just get real quick into some effects of the dairy industry on America. Look, milk is not good for you. A quarter of Americans cannot digest milk. It doesn't make your bones strong. That's just been a lie from day one. And it tastes bad to drink. That's not a result. It's just a reality. But what I really want to talk about, though, what I really want to like get into with the results of this, as far as like public health goes, is this is from intermountainhealthcare.org. Estimates for lactose intolerance vary by ethnicity. African American and Asian ethnicities see a 75% to 95% lactose intolerance rate, while Northern Europeans have a lower rate at 18 to 26% lactose intolerance. It's incredible. So, it's a devastating effect on public health, but it's concentrated on, vulnerable people of color, vulnerable populations. And this is just another, further quotes from intermountainhealthcare.org, the article I got this from. The idea that cheese and milk are essential parts of a well-balanced diet is largely an American-centric and white-centric notion. In fact, the majority of people of color are lactose intolerant. What makes the government's dumping of cheese to low-income individuals particularly egregious is the correlation between race and income. This cheese is not just going to the hands of people without the economic privilege to opt out, it's disproportionately being forced into the bellies of people who cannot digest it. Consuming dairy products while lactose intolerant can plague individuals with a host of symptoms ranging from diarrhea to joint pain and even to difficulty with short-term memory. Because these symptoms occur spasmodically and with varying severity, they are often underreported and misattributed. For those who are lactose intolerant, consuming a large dose of dairy with most meals could mean living with chronic pain or fatigue as a direct result of US policy. It takes a certain amount of privilege to not eat dairy, and incur the associated health risks. So just as government cheese in the Reagan era was just not very good, not very healthy thing that was widely distributed to poor people, to people of color, what we have now are these food swamps in low-income areas where the cheapest, most accessible food for a lot of people is fast food. It's primarily packed with cheese and dairy. It's fucking 7 cheese pizzas and Taco Bell quesadillas, and this is thanks directly to U.S. government and Dairy Management Incorporated specifically. It's so unhealthy to begin with, but it's worse when it's concentrated largely on non-white people with much higher rates of lactose intolerance. Interestingly, while I was reading about this, I did find an article that was about food swamps, and the main argument of the article was essentially that we shouldn't call them food swamps because swamps are actually a rich and valuable part of the ecosystem, and it's kind of offensive to swamps to refer to these fast food heavy areas as food swamps, because swamps are good. All right, some more effects. The unchecked power of the dairy industry is a humanitarian crisis. Dairy farming targets vulnerable populations. I don't want to dive too deep into these ones. I just want to point out a bit how the dairy industry is guilty on a massive scale of crimes that often sort of get scapegoated to other industries. For one, they are just as guilty of exploiting farm workers, undocumented migrants in particular, as other types of farming. People like to make this bizarre argument about how vegans who apparently all eat quinoa 3 meals a day contribute to this kind of exploitation. But the idea that the dairy and meat industries are somehow better is completely laughable. And then there's fucking like slaughterhouse conditions and the mental and just the emotional and psychological trauma that comes with working in a slaughterhouse and murdering cows all day, and the increase in violence and everyday life that comes along with that. Just like, don't fucking get me started on it. It's completely horrific. Another thing, just the human trafficking aspect of this goes like, so what I have written here is Pornhub is in the news a lot lately. So not to be like pro Pornhub, but because they're like not a great website, but the porn industry like in general is something politicians love to focus on in regards to this issue of human trafficking. It's a really strong political issue because people hear the word trafficking, human trafficking, and they're like, they immediately imagine like their children being like child sex trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein. The human trafficking is associated most often, of course, with child sex trafficking. But the reality is of human trafficking in America is that the bulk of it is just about the transportation of undocumented immigrants, undocumented farm workers whose labor is exploited, and who have very little protection under the law. So I just the point of this, like anyway, like sex workers work, support sex workers, don't fall for moral panic and scapegoating that tells you otherwise. Take some of that energy that is like, you know, the anger of human trafficking that's used against sex workers, and use that against the dairy industry because they're the ones who we should actually be going after. Okay, let's meditate on ethical consumption for a second. All right. Okay, we just established in the previous slide, the dairy industry is unethical in a number of ways. But like talking about ethical consumption and how you can engage with the dairy industry if you're someone who is, you know, not lactose intolerant. You know, as far as buying from local providers and whatnot, it's a nice idea, but for the most part, small dairy farmers cannot actually survive in a world where in the same world as these massive dairy conglomerates. Dairy conglomerates, they're like able to lobby for regulations, and this is like where like the real live ethical consumption comes in. They're able to lobby for regulations, like stricter regulations on pasteurization, right? Things that sound very good to someone who wants to ethically consume, but they're things that, you know, small dairy farmers that, treat their cows humanely can't actually afford and will drive them out of business, while large dairy conglomerates can sort of, deal with these things without any harm coming to them. So they drive these small dairy farms out of business, while large dairy farms are able to survive through the complete lie of like ethical consumption with little detrimental effect to these large companies. I don't really have much to say about the idea of ethical consumption in general, other than like, ooh, I do have a little thing here. Like, anyway, one of my friends, like, there's no ethical consumption under capitalism isn't an excuse to consume more. It's a cry to consume less, which I think is a really good take on the idea of ethical consumption in general, right? Because you could be a nihilist and say like, oh, there's no point in even trying to ethically consume when it's all just complete garbage under capitalism. Or you could make the effort to just like reduce your consumption and participation in the system in general, which I think is like a good philosophy to carry with you. So that's kind of just what I have to say about that. And oh God, this is a whole nother ramble I have written down. Let's meditate on growth for a second. This is just something I think about a lot. Under capitalism, profit is not enough. Capitalism runs on speculation. Speculation is based on growth, when the goal is not simply to make consistent profit, but to always make more profit, and then more profit than that, and then more than that. There is absolutely no way to succeed as a company without exploiting, without cutting corners, without lying, without abusing. And this is why if you work a retail job, like I work a retail job, you realize that it's after a certain point, no matter how much the company makes, exploitation and abuse are just necessities. Wages don't go up. Worker conditions don't improve. Nothing changes as the company's profits increase, because they need to make more profits than that in the next corner. And you just hit a wall with absolutely every company, where the only way to make more profits than the previous quarter, right, is to worsen the conditions of the workers. And obviously this applies to exploitative dairy companies. So there's really no possible way for the working conditions of dairy companies to improve under capitalism, because the idea of an economy driven by growth simply does not allow for that at like a basic logical level. And this is something that's fundamentally okay in America. So like I think personally a lot about 2016, like the first time Trump not paying taxes was like a big news cycle, right? And this was just a news cycle 6 months ago also, right? Mm-hmm. But it comes back around once in a while. But even 4 years ago when he was running, same thing. Like his detractors were up in arms about it, right? Because like, oh, it's so immoral, it's so unethical. He's like not paying any taxes for his billions of dollars, right? But his supporters, and these are the same people who argue that undocumented immigrants don't pay taxes and have no place in America, they were completely fine with it. You would try to bring it up with it, and you would find out they were completely okay with this fact, because, quote, like he has an obligation to make a profit for his shareholders. And the thing is, like in a significant sense, they are correct, right? Doing the morally and ethically wrong thing is often the only way to generate growth, generate profit for shareholders. It's the only way to make them happy. So it's not necessarily that like the conservatives who now support Trump don't understand it. It's just that they have no fucking moral backbone whatsoever. And they refuse to see how a system that requires exploitation, requires the complete lack of morality to keep moving forward, is actually a bad thing to begin with.
So like, are they the puppets, but they're also the puppeteers, because like Big Dairy is ultimately like they're running the show, but like they also are like on the stage of a different show, which is the government, which is like
and the way they position themselves is just like as victims, and that's why they make these like false efforts to like push like regulations of their industry to further this idea of ethical consumption. But it's just to ensure their dominance, because they can afford it, right? Because paying fees, like paying fines, going up against government regulation is just the cost of business when you're rich, right? When you're making tons of money. It's just fees, because ultimately the profit is more than what you pay. So the same idea. Okay, some implications. It is not just about cheese. And I feel like we've already kind of gotten here to a little bit. But surplus is everywhere. We talked about the maple syrup vaults, but according to the slide that I'm reading right now with you folks, it's not even just food. It's not just food products. It's so much more. So we have to consider other overfunded monstrosities with unchecked power and influence. This is the US military budget from 2020. The United States spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. I have a quote here, and this is specifically about like what the way surplus works, exactly the same way as the cheese vaults. It's still, listen, it's still like about cheese vaults. It's still about surplus, but it's also not. The United States spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. So, but this argument from the internet, from online posits, is no, it isn't just cheese. This is why everything is full of corn syrup too. This is what determines what your house is made from, and where roads are going to be built, and how closely the safety of your drinking water is monitored, and about weapons. The military-industrial complex is partly about bullying other countries for oil, but it's mostly about propping up a wobbly Jenga tower of military weapons and vehicle producers who offload their rapidly outdated equipment through the police force, which is why there's such a violent opposition to reducing funding for the massively overfunded police force. It's the major drain on the overstuffed cheese vault of military hardware. The point of equipping American cops in that absurd nonsense and loosing them on innocent civilians isn't about equipping the cops, it's about offloading the equipment. It's about offloading the equipment. The loss of civilian lives is considered an acceptable cost for supporting the infinite growth of the weapons production industries. So this is, the core idea of what we're looking at here. If you've been out on the streets up against, the results of, $732 billion of military funding leading into surplus, contributing to the militarized police forces. It's the same liberal philosophy, right? It doesn't actually, like, the military is in theory publicly funded, right? But it goes along with the same liberal obsession with private industry, because it's about, in essence, propping up the weapons industries and Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and all these same things. So that's why, like, the liberal philosophy doesn't go against the overfunding of the military and the military industrial complex and the prison industrial complex. It works with it. It is the same fundamental thing. So that's really where we land. So next year, like in 2021, when very hopefully, I really hope for all of you and very much for myself, you're vaccinated. But then also probably you're back out on the streets and you're facing off against armored cops who are flooding your community with poisonous gas and firing flashbang grenades into crowds of civilians who actually can't escape because they've been kettled by the police telling them to vacate the area. As the cycle of state violence against the vulnerable continues under a new presidential administration that stands for absolutely nothing, and I mean nothing, if not ensuring the infinite perpetual strength of the U.S. military-industrial complex, then maybe, just maybe, you will find yourself thinking, damn, this is just like that shit with the cheese vaults.
Goals for next meeting.
Goals for next meeting.
Eric, that was so good.
Thank you.
So
I'm fucking inspired.
So one thing that sticks out to me is the Domino's 7 cheese pizza. What are those 7 different cheeses?
That's a great question.
Can you name?
Not going to get an answer from me.
7 cheeses.
Let me
name.
allow me
7 cheeses.
Allow me to name 7 different cheeses.
Everyone name a cheese.